Hi, my name is Rica Takashima. I was born in Japan and grown up in Japan and moved to New York City in 2008. So my manga are this Italian version and the English version are Japanese manga comic style. The story about the lesbian couple. あとなんだろう。何でもいいよ。
Hello, my name is Jennifer Crute. I'm an illustrator, painter, cartoonist. I do a bunch of things. Right now, I'm working on Jennifer's Journal, The Life of a Suburban Girl. I have many subjects. I just touch on every subject that comes up in my life, and it started while I was working and complaining about the things that were going on at work that were unjust, and then it turned into this. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cristy C. I'm originally from Miami, Florida, where I started writing around 97, and that just snowballed into like doing illustrations, and it was all about punk, and it just snowballed into writing more personal stuff, and then that turned into like doing more illustrated like long novels, and then my last one is called Spit and Passion. This came out maybe 2013, and it's a similar narrative to a lot of my stuff where I write about, I've written a lot about healing from abuse and my family and my just like depression and all this, but this is all about being 12, growing up in Miami, Florida. I'm Cuban American, and it's about like wanting to hold on to that culture that you grew up around, when knowing that you're queer and there might be the possibility of getting kicked out of the house. So my choice was to stay in the closet, and it's a book about being in the closet and like how do you make the closet work for you until you're ready to come out of it. And so that's the last book. Right now, taking a break from illustrated stories, and I'm working on a tarot card deck, which is somewhat of an illustrated story, but I'm not going to be doing the descriptions. I'm just making these paintings and doing my band and trying to not talk about my personal life right now.
Hi, my name is Carlo Quispe, and I live here in New York City. And I make a comic book called Uranus Comics. It was published by Printed Matter in 2010. And there's also the Hard to Find Uranus number 0. But you can find it through Printed Matter. They still sell it, but you have to go through them to do that. Because I ran out of copies. I make like these kind of like art books, but then also I make like zines and then like mini comics. And I'm also like trying to Skillshare. So right after this panel, I'm doing a workshop on art books, and so I brought some samples of my original art, because I actually start everything with making my own books, because I believe in recycling. And so there's this amazing facility in New York called Materials for the Arts. And if you get hooked up with a nonprofit, somehow get an appointment to go there and get free materials, I literally start with my paper, fold it up, cut it up, and then do my books. And they become like my art objects that I can scan and use for illustrations and comics. And that's also that's another job. I also like teach art too, and then do all sorts of other jobs. And then all of that is reflected in the comics. So yeah, I'm just trying to get by.
My name is Sina Shamsavari. My art name is Sina Sparrow. I do comics, and I recently completed a PhD about queer comics as well. And thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. So in this panel, we're going to be talking about, I have some questions for the whole panel concerning being a queer person of colour, making comics, thinking about it in hopefully in a variety of different ways, from how influences to how we're representing ourselves, to also thinking about matters of production and distribution, and all of those aspects. Whatever's ultimately going to be most interesting to the people on the panel and the people in the audience, hopefully, is what we're going to focus on. So I have questions for everyone on the panel. So I'll start with those, but really I'm happy for people to really take it in the direction that they want to, and to look at things that matter to them, and also will be welcoming questions from the audience as well. Okay. Thinking about the people on this panel, I would say we all more or less started making comics relatively recently, from I think most of us starting in the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. So we're all kind of, the cartoonists on this panel are all kind of relatively recent queer cartoonists. And what I'm kind of interested in is, to begin with, is thinking a bit about who were the queer cartoonists who influenced you to begin making comics, and how easy was it, or did you, were any of those cartoonists also people of colour? Because in my research, which has mainly focused on queer male comics published in America over the last 40 years, it's been quite difficult to find a lot of queer people of colour making comics until relatively recently. So I wonder if that was an issue for any of you, thinking about who you were looking at, who was doing comics already, who you were influenced by.
I couldn't find any queer comic authors growing up. Like, as a kid, it's like I had the art that I knew was like inspiring to me. Like, I loved Ren and Stimpy, and I loved with Jonah Vasquez, that I had an era really liking him. But yeah, I feel like I couldn't really find stuff, and then it felt, when I was younger, it felt intimidating to like look for it. Like, I felt like the gay stuff that I was like learning about, I had to do in secret. So it was like these very specific things that I would find, like. But I grew up with punk music, and I feel like as far as art and inspiration was all a lot of punk stuff, and there was some queer punk bands that like really influenced me, and some zines that, like the zine Doris. It's not, she's queer, but as far as queer people of color making art, like I was like Frida Kahlo and like Diego Rivera and like all these artists that like I would hear about. But yeah, it took me a while to like find other queer cartoonists. Like, when I was like older and already doing my thing, I would like meet other people that were doing really, I don't know, just cool stuff and cool zines. And but yeah, I think maybe if somebody else has more of a history, because I'm learning so much at this conference too, as far as learning about queer cartoonists of color.
Well, would you like to go ahead, or?
My background wasn't comics, so I was a commercial illustrator, and I started to talk about what was going on in the industry, and it spilled into talking about what went on in my childhood, what went on in my family. Like, depression is a big taboo in my family, but I've noticed in a lot of Black families that they're not talking about depression. And then, especially within the church. And then the church had its issues. Well, I had issues with the church, I'll say that instead. And I just realized that, okay, if I'm using these comics to express how I feel about work and things that happened in school and things that happened in my childhood, I can talk about anything. So this is kind of a new thing for me. So I'm not really, wasn't seeking queer comics. I was seeking whoever's being honest about the human experience. That was really my focus on how can I fully be human in this new art form? Because I wasn't allowed to be in the commercial art world. I had to do what the art director said.
Well, that already, I don't mean to interrupt anyone's flow, but like already I feel like everyone on this panel is coming from so many different viewpoints. You're coming from very influenced by punk, which is all about freedom of expression, even if there are issues
Even if
within
they
that
fail
subculture.
sometimes.
Exactly.
But, yeah.
And then in commercial illustration, it's something completely different. It's not about you as an artist. It's you fulfilling a brief. So that's interesting to then think about sexuality and ethnicity and how that feeds into how that can be played out, I guess, in these different kind of fields. But Rica, if you want to take the question of influence.
私が漫画を描き始めたのは1995年に日本でなんですけど、その当時はレズビアンの漫画、LGBT とかレズビアンが描いているレズビアンの漫画っていうのも全然なくて、それで普通のノンケの人たちが描いてるレズビアンのお話っていうのは全部悲しい話だったりとか、SF サイファイの中でのだから許されるものだったりとかして、もうそういうものしかなくても自分が読みたい漫画がなかった。だからそのことに逆に影響されて、私はもう明るくてポジティブでもうみんなが元気が出るようなレズビアンのストーリーを書き始めたのが最初です。
So back when I started drawing manga in 1995, I'd been born and raised in Japan, for those of you who may have stepped in late. And in Japan at the time, there really were no lesbian artists, women artists who introduced lesbian or queer content, but it was always in the, especially in terms of lesbian content, it was always either a tragic story or it was set in some sort of sci-fi or setting and really acceptable forms of expression at the time. So, I actually got influenced by the fact that there was nothing out there that I actually wanted to read. And I wanted to put out something that I wanted to read myself. And what that is, especially, is a real life story that is bright and cheerful. And, it's not like people are killing themselves at the end.
Thank you. So, I think it's really interesting thinking about that kind of, because everyone else here is working more or less in an American context, right? But thinking about the Japanese context and thinking about how, I think to Western readers, it often seems like a much more sexually open context for in manga and comics, especially when it comes to representations of queer male relationships, I think. So that's really interesting. I don't know.
Well, but the flip side of that, though, is that a lot of the openly, it's such a charged word, but openly gay male content is not actually produced by gay men.
Mm-hmm.
It's produced by straight women for straight women consumption.
Yes.
So that's another layer on top of that.
Yeah, so that's really interesting within that context.
Yeah.
Carlo.
Okay, so I'm wearing I have too many comic book T-shirts. Okay, and so I've been told. So I don't know if you can read the title here.
Yes.
Okay, it's called Tales from the Closet, which is a comic that was made by Ivan Villas Jr., who is one of my heroes, and I'm grateful that he's around. Because when I became aware of him, I was already seeking him out. I just didn't know that he existed, and so up until then, all I had was Wendell, right? And Wendell has people of color friends, but he's still the focus of the story, right? And he's great. Wendell's great. He likes to get tied up, and I think that's really cool. So there's levels, of enjoyment, in this and that comic, and actually. I remember clearly the way that I found the comic because it was in a used bookstore, and it was in the special interest section, which was all the way in the back, in the bottom. And I said, well, this is not gonna be missed. And it was like the first printing, like the first edition of the Wendell book, the first collected. And I stuffed it under my shirt, and I stole it because I didn't want to, be out at 13, 14. So I just like stole it. And then of course my mother found it, and I was like outed to my family. I left all these trails, I guess, but like, she, also I had an illustrated diary. So all my like sexual encounters when I was a little kid were depicted, in like diagram form. List of things, and who did what to who, and so that was also like a graphic, memoir kind of thing. But I was like always into comics. Like I'm always like into the Charlie Brown comic strip. That's my favorite comic strip ever because it's he's like the most famous and most lucrative cartoonist there ever was, and I can only look up to that, and so there's that influence. And then Crazy Cat and Tintin when I was living. I'm from Peru, but my family moved to Europe, so then suddenly I was introduced to the European comics and that history. And of course, Tintin is very racially charged there also, and then Tintin goes to Peru. He gets kidnapped by the Incan, like the secret Incan tribe that's still around. And Tintin knows about the eclipse, and they don't. So he gets to control. He gets to control the sun. And so he's, his life is spared. So but at the end, of course, the llama is always spitting on Captain Haddock's face. So at the end, you get a little bit of little poetic justice there, because they know what they're doing, and so there's a little joke there. So there's those influences, those like very traditional like European influences, but then also there's some gay comics, and then there's the Tales from the Closet, and so it's all connected in that way. So now it's time to revert it back into the the larger world.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting what you were talking about in terms of thinking about these kind of really mainstream white Western comics influences. And I mean, whether you're thinking about what, just doing independent comics for yourself, whether you're, like you, Jennifer, working within an illustration industry and then deciding to do your own comics, there are lots of, well, I think it's interesting to think about the fact that there are quite few kind of role models for queer cartoonists of colour, and a lot of the storylines you're talking about from Tintin are these kind of white imperialist storylines. You obviously still were enjoying them on a different level, but I think it's kind of interesting to think about, and I wonder what people think about the fact that we're kind of exposed to so many stereotypes, stereotypical representations of queer of colour identities, people of colour identities. I think queer, even harder to find specifically queer people of colour represented in mainstream comics, but we're kind of exposed to all of these stereotypical representations and narratives. And on the panel yesterday, Derek Scott was talking about his relationship to the character of Nubia, who's Wonder Woman's black twin sister, who was introduced in the 70s and appeared in you're creasing your brow. Yeah, she appeared in about 5 comics.
Yeah, she's never been done well.
She's never, yeah. But he was talking about how he was so kind of engaged with this figure of this really powerful black woman, Wonder Woman's sister, you know. At the same time, he loved the fact that she was wearing this leopard print dress. At the same time, he found it problematic. So, like, I think one can have a really complicated relationship with these kinds of stereotypes. So, yeah, I guess I'd like you to talk more about that, and then you're talking about then taking all of these things, putting them together and then putting them back out into the world. So how does one do that? What are the challenges? And then I think Rica, probably in a Japanese context, I imagine it's different again.
Well,
Yeah.
white is the minority. White is the other
Yeah.
in Japan. I mean, so it's a
Absolutely.
completely different concept.
And yet, okay, to complicate that at the same time, a lot of manga, fantasy manga stories do represent characters which are supposedly Japanese, but look kind of European, blonde, you know, different color hair, all of
キャラクター
that.
日本人のはずなのに、やっぱり外国人に、アメリカ人から目から見たら、外国人に見えるテーマとかよくあるじゃない。
Ah.
Sorry, I mean that's a lot. So you don't,
私ちょっと話させてもらいますけど、私が日本で漫画を描き始めた時にはそういうエスニシティとかもう全く意識したことがなかった。それはなんか日本は単一民族国家だっていうふうに思い込んでたからなんですね。なんかニューヨークに2008年に引っ越してから初めてこんなにいっぱいバラエティの人が本当に目の前にいるっていうことは初めて意識した。それまで日本っていうのは朝鮮とか中国の人ってものすごい日本にいっぱいいるにもかかわらず、みんな日本の名前を使っているからわからない。みんな隠してる。それは差別が怖いから。
So back when I started writing manga, I have to say I was not even cognizant of ethnicity because Japan is generally regarded, and we're raised in Japan to think of ourselves as a one-race country, which I know has been taken up in academia as well. It was only after I came to New York in 2008 that I was astonished and actually surrounded by a very diverse group of people, and realized that I was actually finally around other races. And, that's not to say, I mean, it's partly my own ignorance because, of course, there are plenty of non-Japanese Asians that live in Japan, Koreans and Chinese in particular, some of whom are several generations born and raised in Japan, but most of them take on Japanese names and hide the fact that they're not Japanese because they're very frightened of discrimination, which is actually very real. And so I didn't even know that there were other races or other ethnicities living, in my own neighborhood.
で、ようやくニューヨークに引っ越してからは本当に私が実際会っている人たち、それは例えばクイーンズだったらばインドとかバングラディッシュとかグリークとかイタリアの人たちと実際会った人たちをヒントとかモデルにして描くようになった。それでブロンクスで会った人たちはプエルトリカンとかハイティアンの人たちに実際会ってからそういう人たちの、クイアのモデルを漫画とかアート作品の中で表現するようになった。
So it was only after I moved to New York that I actually even had models upon to base my current work, my new work. For example, in Queens, I met a lot of Indians and Bangladeshi, Italians and Greek folk that I was able to incorporate as characters in my future work. And for example, in Bronx, I was able to meet a lot of Puerto Ricans and Haitians. But I mean, I do not just cartooning, but I also do illustrations and 3D art. But it was only truly after I came to New York that I even became aware of ethnicity, but was able to incorporate it based on the people that I
そういう意
met.
識を生まれさせてくれてもニューヨーク市にも本当に感謝してます。
So I'm really grateful to New York and New Yorkers for opening my eyes.
Yes.
Well, that's really interesting because it's such a contrast from the person of color experience in somewhere like America, which is where we are. So I wonder what you guys could talk about.
Reality, it's hard for me as a black woman because of all of the stereotypes, I'm always talking for myself, but I'm never talking for myself once it gets out into the public. So as soon as my work comes out, it's like I'm always representing. So I always have to keep that double mind of, okay, how is this going to look? So it's like this self-censorship that I'm always back and forth on, because I know what's going on in my life and it's a real thing, but is it like, oh, well, she's just being a whore?
Yeah.
So, and it doesn't matter what
Because I mean,
sex. It's
obviously there are different stereotypes about different people of different ethnicities, and it varies according to gender and sexual orientation and all of that. But I mean, that's a really interesting point. Do you feel like you're speaking for yourself, or do you feel like you're representing a group? And I think that's something that all people of colour creating culture, and all queer people creating culture, have to think about. I mean, historically, I think, especially, but even now as well.
Growing up, I touching a little bit on the question you asked before. Growing up, I would see so much representations of different races, which reminds me of the Wonder Woman story you were saying. I'd never even heard of her before. Like, now I'm like, I'm gonna Google that. But there would be these characters of color that were friends, like Barbie's friends, for example. Yeah. And the black Barbie was named Cristy. So I was like, yeah, and she dressed orange, like Barbie and the Rockers. And she she played guitar too, and she dressed orange. And I was like, that's the one. That's my friend. But it still felt, it felt like this is I felt like this rebellion, like, yeah, I'm going to have the character that nobody knows about. But then it's like, of course, the character of color is the one that nobody knows about, who's like the sidekick that appears sometimes. Strawberry Shortcake was the same. It was Orange Blossom. Yeah, and it was like, she would pop up every now and then, and then I'd be like, there she is, bring her closer. And then it's like, but no, let's hang out with Strawberry again, and it was always like that, and I just kind of gave up, and that's what really connected me to punk. And then, so it's like, even though in punk, I'm still acknowledging these like racist things, or like, not diverse representations of people in music and in zines. But it felt, since it was a small community and I was a part of it, it felt like I could change that. Like I could, and if any of you were in the 9 a.m. workshop on QPOC activist art, like it was very amazing and inspiring. And I'm like, and some of their work, I'm like, I love, I'm like taking pictures of all the slides. I'm like, I'm gonna get that tattooed. And like, it's like stuff like that I was discovering like after the fact, like after I started writing a zine and after I started like exploring things through like, I put my zine on AOL, 1999 AOL Press websites, and I'll write about it on there. And I'm like, I'm writing this zine. I'm from Miami, and like it was never like about race in the beginning, because that was another thing. Like growing up in Miami, where it's like predominantly Latino, and we're just like, you go to the store and they talk to you in Spanish, and if you don't speak Spanish, they're just like. And then and Miami's super conservative though at the same time, so it was this like double-edged like what do? I love being here, and like they're like my culture's so alive and blah blah blah, but then it has its problems, like, and there's so much prejudice, like there's so much like light skin white supremacy in that Latino community, and it's really scary. So I'm like, I'm going to Brooklyn where I can be a weirdo, and Abuelita isn't gonna look at me on the street and be like, she's possessed. And I'm like, maybe I am, like, maybe by something good that wants to help you, like, so like, yeah, so it was, I feel like seeing all these like newer artists and like, or artists who have been producing in the era that I've been producing is what really like made me feel safe, like drawing diverse characters, and made me inspired too, because it was like suddenly I felt powerful to like draw people of different ethnicities and different stuff like that, and it feel like this isn't about race, it's just like this is my life, like my friends just happen to be, or like this, when I'm 21 and writing, it's like this idealized like idea of like punk, and that I'm gonna archive in this zine is going to look very diverse because it just so happens that the punks that I ended up growing down with and traveling with and were like the queer punks of color. And like, you know, so it's like kind of like documenting that experience of there being people of color out there who are queer and who I could relate to is kind of what enabled me. And I do mostly do memoirs too. And like I draw all kinds of people of all backgrounds and not just people of color. And there's definitely been eras of my life where I'm drawing a lot of white people because I'm like traveling with all these like white boy punk bands in the early 2000s and like interviewing them and all my zines. And if a lot of people would read my zine and not even know that I was Latina because it was like, I'm so obsessed with punk and like, I'm so, you know, and then it wasn't until I started writing about my mother that they're like, oh, she's Cuban and like grew up with all this like class stuff and all this mental health stuff. And then I felt like I could, I don't know, like when I learned to like present this, my like cultural identity, I felt like I could finally like, just, I don't know, like take myself seriously and critique the art that made me uncomfortable. Like, you know, like seeing old comics and like old.
This is Christy's work, so.
Yeah, awesome. Just seeing like old representations of people of color and in like old like Looney Tunes and stuff like that. Like I'm like, this stuff is real and this stuff was like on television and it's like so uncomfortable and it sucks because it's like I still love like the shocking cartoon thing. Like I love, but it, you know, when I was little, I got obsessed with Fritz the cat and I was like, this is so edgy and radical. But then it's like the more I watch it, the more I'm like, this is really racist and sexist and awkward. And it's this cat and it's a little cat. Like this cat, I feel bad for him. He's like put in this position of being an oppressor and, you know. Yeah, but
so that, I mean, it's really interesting to me because it always, you're going back to this idea of like appropriating mainstream influences.
Yeah, and it's like I can't help that I like it too.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
Oh,
yeah. No, I feel like there was an era that I judged myself. Like I started to do, I was like, I should screen print more. Like that's how, if I'm gonna do political work about like culture and gender and oppression, and I should be screen printing because that's like the political thing. And like, and it's like this like, yeah, and it's like why drawing in my notebook on the subway is also DIY. So, yeah, I don't know. Like I definitely had eras of like judging like the merit of like my work and what I'm doing, and then you know with time it's just kind of like just do my best. And like one thing that it's like the older I get, the more I edit myself for like, is this alienating? Is this funny to me but offensive to other people? Like thinking stuff like that as I edit myself is, it's like the older I get, the more I do that, and the more I like, because I'm aware that my work is going to be out in the world too, and like I'm not like, it's like this was published through Feminist Press, and then and that was a realization I had with my last book from 2008, Bad Habits. The publisher didn't want to say that it was about healing from abuse in the press release. So I was just and it was like, oh, it's like, we don't want it to be this like tortured Latina who is dealing with her love problems. And it's like, well, then like don't release the book and like here's your advance back. But yeah, I was younger at the time too, and I'm like, I need this money, I gotta pay the Con Edison bill. And like and I made an anti-press release that I mailed out to everyone, and like, so it's like, you know, there's all these like hurdles to jump if you like want to tell your actual story, but yeah, eventually I'm just kind of like, I'm tired of jumping the hurdles. I'm just gonna like tell my story. If someone wants to publish it, cool. If someone doesn't want to publish it,
you can do it yourself.
Crowdfunding is an interesting thing. Yeah, and there's so many outlets of like self-publishing. I just heard about Printed Matter the other day.
I'll hook you up.
And like, yeah, I'm like, what is this? It's like, it's on, you'll know better. It's a little shop with a lot of printed matter, and it's really beautiful.
Okay, so Carlo, why don't you talk a bit about
I can actually talk about Printed Matter some more.
Yeah, sure.
got hooked up with them, and then one of the jobs that I did for them was this comic called Artists and Activists. And so, okay, one of the things about them is that, okay, just like there's like all this shame about, being different, they have a lot of shame about like, they don't want to, okay, they're really careful, okay, about what kind of things that they sell, because they want to retain their reputation as like a high art kind of place. Okay, so if they get rid of their reputation for selling comics, suddenly people will think that they're not longer like an art store. They'll think that they're a comic book store. Okay, so there's this like, they don't want to, they're in the closet about selling comics, okay? But you will find comics there. You just have to go to the back, to the bottom shelf, and there's where they have their comics, okay? So I'm really trying to, work with them so that they can sell comics. So this job here that I did for Uranus Number 0 is actually part of this Artists and Activists series, which has like other zines that are made by other activist groups. And I'm the only one who, is doing the comics. So the thing is though, I did comics, but there's a lot of drawings in there, okay? Because I had to sneak them in, okay? It's always like a strategy to like include yourself where you're not included. So in Printed Matter, they're not including comics. Guess what? I'm gonna include my comics in the fucking drawings without you even knowing, and you're gonna become a comic book store without you, whether you like it or not, right? And so the other thing about the this comic is that I also knew that they're a predominantly white audience, need some help. They're not like going to the to the anti-racist workshop like they should. So here perhaps is some help. Here perhaps is the answer. Like if people are going to they're going to buy things, they're looking for answers. Like why don't we give them some answers, right? So I found this really good quote, and I thought I would read it. It's by Bell Hooks, who I find really inspiring, right? So she says, "All too often our political desire for change is seen as separate from longings and passions that consume lots of time and energy in daily life. Particularly, the realm of fantasy is often seen as completely separate from politics. Yet, I think of all the time Black folks, especially the underclass, spend just fantasizing about what our lives would be like if there were no racism, no white supremacy. Surely, our desire for radical social change is intimately linked with the desire to experience pleasure, erotic fulfillment, and a host of other passions." Right? So it's these other passions, that essentially that this comic is about, because this is all about like where you can go get tested for STDs in New York City, which is all about sex and passion, right? When you have sex and passionate sex, sometimes you get STDs, right? So then this is a list of places in New York City where you can go get tested for free. And this is each place in each borough, right? So there's a whole process of going to all these different boroughs, and also telling the stories of the people who go to these places, right? So I try to create a little, conceptual comic here for people, right? And so the more the more you're like me, I suppose, the more you'll identify with this comic, because even though it's not in color, see, that's the tricky part about my comics, is that they're mostly black and white. So then how do I depict people of color without using like the Charlie Brown, like Lincoln shading, and is that problematic still? Like isn't Lincoln incredible? Okay, but okay, so what I do is actually, and then the other thing about people, mostly white readership, is that they'll assume that the character they're reading is the race where they're from, right? So you know what, I'm just gonna let you do that. Perhaps your friend will point out, hey, this guy is actually not white. Look, he's got like, a different kind of nose, or perhaps he's got a different kind of hairstyle. If you're cued into those things, if you're already familiar with those that visual language, then you will get that person is a person of color, right? But if you don't, right, you just want to, you're living in your little, you can't see past your nose. So then you're gonna assume that this character is white also. But like in this comic, this is for a comic book called World War III Illustrated, and we try to tell truths. And so this story is about undocumented immigrants, about how they don't want to be called illegal anymore, they want to be called undocumented, and how they're disclosing their status as undocumented so that they can stop living in shame and fear of what people will think of them, and if they're going to drop the dime on them and call ICE and get them deported. Right, and also the story is about how there's groups of people who are actually queer young people, like high school students, who organize to protest these deportation jails and manage to get people out of them because they show that these people have support from their community. They're not criminals; they're students or whatever, so they're not. So they sometimes let them out of the deportation jail. But so anyway, this there's like strategies you have to implement to get in there without people even like perhaps even knowing that you're there, because then it would become a problem. But by the time that it's a problem, you're already there and it's too late.
Okay, I kind of want to. Everything that you've been saying has brought up a number of questions for me that I want to throw back at you. But Jennifer, I wanted to kind of start with you because Cristy and Carlo especially have been talking a lot about making independent comic work. You mentioned at the start about how your work has come from a different place. Can you talk a bit about what you found frustrating within the mainstream illustration world? And I kind of want to, and maybe what I'm going to bring up is irrelevant to what you're going to say, but very recently, I'm sure a lot of you are aware, a cartoonist working in, I forget his name, working in mainstream comics, did this comic strip about how he was asked to change the colouring, the shading of a character.
It's Ron Wimberly. So Ron Wimberly, who is a black guy who lives in Brooklyn, he did a jam comic, and a jam comic is where one artist takes over for the other. And he knew that the character he was working on, Wolverine's girlfriend, was Dominican, and so he colored her like and he actually lists the actual shade that he uses to represent her brown skin. And the editor was like, what are you doing? And so it became a whole thing online.
Yeah, well, I just think it's really interesting to think about. I think there's often kind of quite unspoken or subtly communicated pressures on artists working within mainstream industries. I wonder if those are the kinds of things you were talking about when you were talking about feeling frustrated within mainstream illustration or other things.
The biggest one is exactly that: changing color, changing shape, sizes. I don't know. Do you have any of my work?
I don't.
You don't? Okay.
No.
Go online.
Let's go online.
You can go to my website.
Yeah. Let's do that.
The last major illustration gig, and I was working for like pretty big companies and making some money, and it was always, can you make the nose smaller? Can you make the lips smaller? Can you make the skin lighter? And the worst one was for a hair care ad, and they asked me to not only do all those things. This is my commercial illustration.
Yeah, I wanted to show this to show the contrast.
I have a few different styles that I use, but this was the main style that I used for all of my commercial illustration gigs. And the last one, they were writing me the email and they were like, do all these things. And then finally they were like, just can you make her look more European? And it was like, I had the weekend, it was a lot of money. And I was just like, oh, shoot. And of course, I just did the work, but I was like, okay, it's time to leave this industry because I don't want to end up pouring all of the talent that I have problems with the word talent because I think talent is just a realization of what you can do with something that makes you feel
your energy, your time, your imagination, all of it, your training.
It's your joy. It's what you prepare. It's what you practice every day that brings you joy. but I just didn't feel like I was going to pour all of that energy that I used to make myself feel better from all of the racism that I was taking in. Like, I had to perm my hair. It was just, unacceptable not to do it in my house, at school. Kids would make fun of you. So I just didn't feel like I'm not going to pour my talent into an industry that has made me feel inferior in the first place. So, of course, I did the gig, but from then on, I just stopped doing a lot of commercial work that dealt with a lot of money. And then I started to think about my other projects, and I just kind of dropped off from seeking out any more illustration gigs. And then I started to really get into more of the comic book work. If you click on that one with the license, this is what I did for Lambda Legal. And it was like a life without fair courts. So I started to do just a little bit more conscious work.
Can I comment?
Interesting to see the style you're using for your own comics versus the commercial illustration style. Because, I mean, one thing I noticed looking at the commercial illustration was that you actually were showing a lot of characters of colour, which seems... I mean, I know that's what you're showing on your website. Right. It may not have been the majority of what you were commissioned.
Oh, the majority of what I was commissioned to do, urban... That's what they. Every gig was, can you make her hips smaller? Can you make her, clothes more revealing? So it just started to move towards.
It's really interesting because, I think we're very familiar with this kind of thing when we think about photography. Most advertising is photos of celebrities often, whether we're talking about anonymous models, but especially celebrities, it's very clear when Beyonce has been photoshopped, for example, in an ad for L'Oreal or whatever you're talking about. But this is really interesting to think about you being hired, presumably because they
see my hand,
your illustrations of people of colour. They want you for that, but then they want you to
wanted to skew it to what they want.
Yeah, I mean. And in a way, that is that's industry and that's capitalism.
That's racism.
And but those things aren't pretty intertwined. So, then it's kind of interesting to see. Sorry,
No, I just want to comment something on the illustrations because I also do freelance illustration, but I feel I'm not stuck in a bad way. I'm just honed in on my punk community and activist stuff and people just hiring me to do what I already do, because when I was working with bigger clients and trying to do that for a living, it was that experience, but I would turn out terrible looking work. So I just wanted to comment on how these pieces that I could imagine you being God, this isn't my vision. But they still managed to look really beautiful. And but it's stressful that it's you have to tone down the real talk and
It's really weird because in my experience of commercial illustration has been exactly the opposite, but that's because I've been doing illustration for mainly for charities that are really all about diversity and representation.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about style as well. This style for your personal comics is very different.
It is very different, and I actually got a review from. I'll just say I got a review, and they were they were saying that it was so disjointed because I do talk about some heavy stuff with my comics, and for me it was therapeutic because I've seen a lot of crap growing up, and for me it's always been like I said, I talk about depression, I talk about this going through trauma, but for me drawing these round cute little cartoons, when I look at them, it makes me laugh at the situation. My father used to leave me outside in the car in the Bronx while he would go get with women. This is 1980s. And it always hurt me. It always oh man, how could he do that to me? And then one day I just drew this picture of me sitting in the car and one through some fire, and it transformed. It transformed a part of me that was like, that is hilarious. I'm freaking out. I'm trying to shove myself under the seat. You know, for me, it takes off that heavy, like, oh, he did that to me. And it pulled my power back that I could draw something and make it funny.
That's really interesting, but I also kind of think, because they kind of look like dolls to me, they look like, you know, but I think that's a fairly familiar strategy, or that has been a fairly familiar strategy in indie comics of talking about really heavy issues, but drawing in a kind of naive way or a cartoonish way, in a way, and it's often talked about as a way of kind of drawing the reader in with the seeming innocence of the surface, and then kind of shocking them. But that's for the it's kind of interesting for you. It's almost for you. It's processing something very painful and making it less painful through the humor.
Yeah.
But then it perhaps has an opposite effect for the I just think that's really interesting. Because they were saying that it was disjointed, and I assume that's because of the subject matter versus the style. I mean, to me that's kind of a weird criticism, because I think that's a very established kind of strategy for cartoons.
And I'm not the only one that does it, so I found that strange.
Mm-hmm.
So
reminds me of Barefoots also, like Howard Chris's Barefoots. It's also very cutesy, like the stuff that he did before Wendell was very like psychedelic. He was also dealing with issues, and he was also criticized for the cutesy style and the heavy subjects. But I think that's what that's how you get it out there. Yeah,
that's how I get it out of me.
Thinking about cute drawing style, if Rico, could you talk a bit more about that?
もちろんなんか私が漫画を描けるみたいなそういう自分のなんか苦い悲しくってそういうあったからこそなんだけどもちろんまあ例えば、自殺未遂とか2回ぐらいしてるんですけど、だけど私はなんかそういう苦い経験は書く気が起きなんかいつも笑いにか。
It's not that I've never a sad experience actually putting that and always end up drawing kind of fun and bright topics instead. I actually attempted suicide twice, mostly half.
Yeah, it wasn't really my intention to say why do you not? Not as an accusation. My question is, in terms of, so you're saying it's kind of like a straightforward, the style and subject matter in your comics kind of mesh quite straightforwardly, as opposed to what Jennifer was talking about.
ただ単純に彼女のスタイルなのか。
わざと明るく楽しく。
But
可愛い表現になってしまうのか。
What I was trying to is the fact that this is her style and not that she's consciously. She says she's consciously her artistic style is perceived as cute by the reader.
Yeah.
だから表現にはこの彼にとっては可愛いんだけど、わざわざ意識して可愛く描いてるのか、ただ単にそれ個人的なスタイル。
いやいや、わざと可愛く描いてる。
I consciously think.
だからなんか彼女みたいな最後書いてるそれと同じ人だと思う。
So I think whatever painful experiences I might have had that is in my content, I do try to draw consciously fun and cheery, but I'm also trying to draw cute. I feel that in that
Something about that cute as being kind of a I don't want to say anger, and then the subject matter being about lesbian relationships is quite sure, producing generally quite happy as
ただレズビアンの人がやっぱり一般の読者にとってはショックだと自分は思ってますけど、リカさんはどう意識してますか？
今日は自分の心の自分を助けるためだったとしか言えない。なんか自分の苦い辛かったティーネイジャーをそのために大人になってから救ったとしか言えない。
I mean, I guess the only way I can describe it is that I wrote this manga as an adult to try to save that sad, depressed teen that I had been. It was a time, I could time trip given it to her so she could have avoided what she went through.
so very similar to what Jennifer is